Hello, dear friends. This subject would seem strange to me if I myself had not experienced it with temporary force, and if I had not seen many other human beings go through the same trance. Now I explain to myself why I liked existentialism so much, because it explained what I felt. Last night I couldn't sleep until I wrote this article, because writing is therapy in itself. Opinion piece. The crisis of Hamacuco. Every human being enters into a crisis. It is an existential crisis. It is only a temporary indisposition. Someday you will find yourself. The world also has a midlife crisis. The 50s crisis is due to a hormonal change. There is depression, emotional alterations, and irritability. The spiritual crisis is called the dark night of the soul. This experience is reflected in books, music, and movies. To get to the heaven, it is necessary to go through purgatory. King David suffered serious confusion and anguish before God. Jesus asked his father why he had forsaken him. Teresa of Calcutta spent her whole life in a permanent crisis. It is a purgatory of the soul leading to union with the Absolute. The world society is also going through the crisis of Hamacuco. Let's start. Years ago, I saw a Buddhist monk waking aimless and in a state of confusion in front of the Alpujarra village of Bubion. My companions told me that he had a Hamacuco and that we should not worry about anything because it was normal. That left me very intrigued because I am curious being who likes to have a rational explanation for everything that happens in the world. Later, I found out that it is normal for all of us to have a crisis at some point, especially those of us who follow a spiritual life. But every human being enters a crisis, sooner or later, just like every society. I thought all of this was absurd until it happened to me. When I found out that this crisis of the Hamacuco is in the Buddhist tradition, in the Christian tradition, and even in the Sufi tradition of Islam, then I meant. In the Buddhist tradition, the practitioner goes through a stage called the knowledge of suffering, which can be compared to the dark night of the soul in the Christian tradition, or a similar experience in the Sufi tradition of Islam. Or put another way, if you want to get to the heaven, you have to go through purgatory. According to Pablo Neruda, someday, anywhere, you will unfailingly find yourself, and that, only that, can be the happiest of them or the most bitter of your hours. There are people who are frightened when they look in the mirror. There are human beings who spend their lives pondering about it without being able to give them a solution or an outcome to the internal problem that directly overwhelms their existence. Existential crisis. The existential crisis could be defined as the period in the life of a human being in which serious questions are raised concerning to the reasons why it is worth living, what motivations drive their actions, and what are the bases on which their own existence is fostered. Existentialism is a philosophical current and later a literary avant-garde oriented around one's own existence through the analysis of the human condition, freedom and individual responsibility, emotions, as well as the meaning of life. It holds that existence precedes essence, that reality is prior to thought, and that will precede intelligence. It posits that the starting point of philosophical thought must be the individual and phenomenological subjective experiences, as well as the existential anguish generated by the apparent absurdity of the world. On this basis, existentialists argue that the combination of moral thought and scientific thought are insufficient to understand human existence, and therefore an additional set of categories governed by the norm of authenticity would be necessary. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche laid the foundations of existentialist philosophy. There are many existentialist authors, but I especially like Hermann Hesse, Albert Camus, and his literature of the absurd, and the nihilist philosopher Émile Cioran. Books, music, and movies. Novelist Scott Fitzgerald famously wrote the phrase, "The real dark night of the soul always happens at 3 o'clock in the morning." In November 2019 was released for the Day of the Dead the discographic material "The Dark Night of the Soul" of the legendary Latin doom metal band Total Death, a new handful of songs that express his emotional state full of pain and anguish, songs that allude to this type of existential crisis. On the other hand, the final episode of Father Ted Going to America, the depressed priest Kevin explains to Ted that he is experiencing the dark night of the soul. In the 2019 film The Two Popes, directed by Fernando Meirelles, Pope Benedict XVI mentions the phrase "the dark night of the soul" to describe his feeling of impossibility to connect with God. This impossibility of connecting with the source could explain why some human beings tend to the dark side. The same thing happens even to machines, and they call it material fatigue. It happens when an appliance or device works for years without problems until one day it starts to fail without knowing what's wrong with it. Some call it programmed obsolescence. But in my country, they say that someone was bitten by a blowfly, or that he got a bad luck, or that a bad wind came and blew him away. But this not only happens to humans and machines, but also to every society enters into crisis at some point in its history, and nobody knows exactly why, although many explanations are written. The World Society is also going through a Hamacuco crisis, with the economic crisis, power cuts, blackouts, floods, earthquakes, and tsunamis, volcanoes, etc. Definition. The word Hamacuco refers to a sudden passing and not serious indisposition. It can be used as a synonym of malaise, tabardillo, telele, patatus, soponcio, or yuyo, sopatipando, arrechucho, faratute, torozón, parraque. The most common in Spain is to say Hamacuco when the meaning of temporary physical alteration of the body that prevents to perform the normal voluntary functions. Thus, it is also used to mean cogorza, infarction, or colic, because it is a truly polysemic word. One could also say Hamacuco or Zamacuco with Zira, which in turn means drunkenness or a foolish, clumsy, and abrupt person, or a person who, keeping quiet or feeling clumsiness, does his will or what is convenient for him. The etymology of Yamacuco or Hamacuco is uncertain, but it probably comes from the Arabic word Samakuk, meaning foolish or malicious. From there, he set out on a long journey. It is seen that the lives of Cuba, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, called Zambiricucos, to the freed mulattoes who often got drunk as if there was no tomorrow. Later, the wet Zambiricuco gave origin to the word Hamacuco, which is one that crossed the pond. The 50s crisis. At the human level, the most well-known is the 50s crisis, although there are those in the 40s and 30s. But the 50s crisis has a simpler explanation, which is a hormonal change in both women and men. In fact, the Mayans said that the complete human cycle is 52 years, which is 13 multiplied by 4. From the age of 33, the same human cycle is repeated, but at a different level, because there are no equal repetitions in life. We are familiar with the menopause syndrome in women, but the crisis of the 50s is less well known in men. However, there is a midlife crisis in both men and women. It is a time to take stock and question certain things. In reality, this crisis occurs between the ages of 45 and 55. It is usually accompanied by psychological symptoms that take away the well-being of the person. Among these are depression, emotional alterations, irritability, and even a decrease in self-esteem. 82% of men suffer from andropause by the age of 50. Midlife crisis can lead to loss of interest, lack of competitiveness, family stress, or acute depression. A 52-year-old friend of mine says that one day she got out of bed and looked in the mirror. She did not recognize herself. As her estrogen level decreased, her skin had lost elasticity and firmness. Her hair had become thinner and brittle. The so-called midlife crisis can happen to everyone, but it seems to be more frequent in men, so much that 8 out of 10 men go through a midlife crisis. There are some physiological symptoms associated with this crisis, such as depression, emotional alterations, irritability, more frequent than usual, and a loss of self-esteem. In medicine, it is a sudden pain or illness when you say that you had a seizure and you have been taken to the hospital. In fact, the Spanish Society of Neurology admits the voice Hamacuco as a synonym for ictus, stroke, embolish, thrombosis, and other trauma of cerebrovascular physiopathology. But I am referring to the spiritual Hamacuco and not to the physical one. Spiritual crisis. The term dark night of the soul is used in Christianity for a spiritual crisis in a journey toward union with God, similar to that described by Saint John of the Cross. Saint Teresa of Lisieux, a 19th century French Carmelite, suffered a similar experience. Focusing on doubts about life after death, she reportedly asked her sisters nuns if they knew in what darkness she was immersed. Although this crisis is usually temporary in nature, it can also last for long periods. Saint Paul of the Cross, Dark Night, in the 18th century, lasted 45 years, from which he recovered. Teresa of Calcutta, according to letters written in 2007, may be the best known official case of this type of crisis. From 1948 almost until her death in 1997, he suffered from it with only a brief period of relief. Franciscan friar Benedict Grestial, a friend of Mother Teresa for much of her life, stated that darkness was crushing her towards the end of her life. Jesus Christ may also have experienced such a crisis when he pronounces on the cross before dying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" In the dark night of the soul, spiritual disciplines such as prayer seems to be suddenly lose all their value. Traditional prayer becomes extremely difficult and thankless for an extended period of time during this famous dark night. The individual may feel as if God has suddenly abandoned him and his prayer life has collapsed. It is important to note, however, that the presence of doubt is not equivalent to abandonment. In fact, there is a strong biblical tradition of genuine confusion before God. King David suffered serious confusion and distress before God, yet this is not condemned or mentioned as unfaithful. Rather than causing permanent devastation, the dark night is seen by mystics and others as a blessing in disguise, whereby the individual is obscured from the spiritual ecstasy associated with acts of virtue. Although the individual may for a time seem to apparently decline in his practices of virtue, he actually becomes more virtuous, in that he is being virtuous less for the spiritual rewards gained and more out of a true love of God. It is a purgatory of the soul that brings purity and union with God. The obscure night of the soul. No one has described the dark night of the soul better than the great Spanish mystic and poet Saint John of the Cross, whom I considered the greatest literary spiritual genius. Upon an obscure night, fevered with love in love's anxiety, O hapless happy plight, I went, none seeing me, forth from my house where all things be, by night secure from sight, and by the secret stair disguisedly, O hapless happy plight, by night and privily, forth from my house where all things quiet be. Blessed night of wandering, in secret, where by none might I be spied, nor I see anything, without the light of guide, save that which in my heart but in my sight. That light did lead on me, more surely than the shining of a noontide, where well I knew that one did for my coming bide, where he abode might none but he abide. O night that didst lead thus, O night more lovely than the dawn of light, O night that brought us, lover the lover's sight, lover with love in marriage of delight. Upon my flowery breast, wholly from him and save himself from none, where did I give sweet rest to my beloved one, the fanning of the cedar's breathed thereum, when the first moving air blew from the tower and waved his looks aside, his band with gentle care did wound me in the sight, and in my body all my senses died. All things I then forgot. My cheek on him who for my coming came, all ceased, and I was not, leaving my cares and shame among the lilies and forgetting them. And that's all for today. Thanks a lot, dear friends.